It's just nostalgia. Rose-tinted glasses, tedious, outdated, unfair. But is it really just nostalgia? The old systems, the old games, the history that surrounds them? Is there something of value there that goes beyond merely being childhood favorites? For many, classic gaming is not just a wistful longing after faint memories, the feel of inserting a cartridge, the soft glow of a CRT. In some homes, these are still everyday experiences. But this does not mean that classic gaming is fixated only on the past. As the original manufacturers move on to new platforms, other companies, organizations, and community members step in as stewards of the old hardware, not only to keep the systems operational and to preserve history, but also to develop new products and modifications to open up new possibilities, to keep interest in the past alive, and to reconcile old games and hardware with the technologies of today. This is the world of vintage gaming, and the story of the people who have made it possible to continue to enjoy the past in new ways. Nostalgia is a strong force in the video game industry. Sega has retold its history in innumerable collections over the years. Nintendo is all too aware of what people feel when they see Mario as a 2D sprite, or when they hear remixes of classic tunes. High-resolution ports and remakes stir up strong emotions and enthusiasm. Even so, the idea of actually interacting with decades-old games and hardware, especially as a job, may seem surprising or unusual to some.
I tell them I work on video games and they ask, did you write Call of Duty? And no. But then I find more and more as we're aging that more of the public knows what an original Nintendo is. If you wear a Nintendo shirt, people know what it is.
Brian Parker, known online as Bunny Boy, runs Retro USB from his home in Northern California. As a prominent member of the homebrew community for the original Nintendo Entertainment System since the early 2000s, he's done everything from programming his own NES games to developing, manufacturing, and selling the AVS, a robust HDMI-equipped alternative to the original NES hardware. But he fell into the scene almost by accident.
I went to UC Santa Cruz for computer engineering, and I was focusing on supercomputer architecture. And when I got out of college, there were no jobs in that anymore. All the companies had gone bankrupt or got bought. And so my best friend asked if he could play NES games on an emulator on his computer using the original controller. And I figured out that was something I could do pretty quick, so I did the first USB adapter.
It may seem like a simple idea today, but the retro port was a big hit.
Overall, I sold many thousands.
Since then, Brian has created an impressive stable of products, including the Power Pack, the first reprogrammable flash cartridge that was sold for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and he's still at it.
It took about at least a year between it being, oh, this is a part-time thing just until I find a real job, until this makes just enough that it makes sense.
But making it work isn't easy. Jason Roush sells parts, kits, and pre-modified consoles from the NES and TurboGrafx-16 on up to the Game Boy Advance and GameCube through his website gametech.us.
I'm sure there's people think that I am like rich just because I sell high definition and ultra HDMI. I don't make that kind of money. But I live off of this because I have no debt. I own the house I live in. I own the cars I drive and I have no credit cards. I can live below the poverty line because it doesn't really take that much money to live. But for most people, no. Because the one thing I've done without is health insurance.
Before going all in on modding, Jason worked as a maintenance repair technician at a factory.
In 2001, I found eBay for the first time. And I just went hog wild, fulfilling all my childhood desires of, at first it was baseball cards. And at some point I was like, I'd like to play Zelda again on the original Nintendo, So I only spent maybe $200-300, and I think I ended up with 50 or 60 games, half of which were still complete in the box, and a top loader. I didn't know what a top loader was. I didn't know existed. Most people don't. They came out in like 93, 94 in the Super Nintendo era.
Nintendo model NES 101, popularly referred to as the top loader, is generally considered to be much more reliable at reading game cartridges compared to the more finicky front-loading model. But the issue is, these units only support RF video output, which is not only lesser quality than composite video, but is also more difficult to integrate into AV setups. Jason found a rudimentary tutorial online for how to modify the top loader to restore composite video output to the system, and thought there might be a market for it.
There was a time, probably 2003 and 4, I was buying almost every top loader that was for sale on eBay, and I would modify them and resell them. Pretty positive I was selling them for $100 modded in the beginning, and I remember stepping up to 125. And at one point, I think I might have been at 150. I remember the jump from 150 to 200 was only like within a year or two. Somebody else was selling them at this point, and they were selling them for $200 composite modded. I was like, that's insane. And they still are, actually.
At the time, composite was the best video quality that anyone could get out of a real NES console without harvesting parts from Nintendo's vintage arcade machines. Alongside RF, composite was the most commonly used connection for game consoles up until the high-definition era. But composite video is inherently a noisy, low-grade signal.
Those games that I loved so much as a kid, when I went back to play them again as an adult, it almost felt like I was looking through a dirty glass window when I was playing it. And I knew, from a background in technology, I knew there's definitely ways to improve it.
Bob Neal began to research analog RGB video, which avoids the pitfalls of composite video by transmitting the uncompressed red, green, and blue portions of the signal down separate video lines. While the NES does not generate video in this format, many other systems do, including the Super Nintendo, PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, and all of Sega's consoles.
And then I realized that there's no information out there at all. The only information was spotty on forums. There were posts that contradicted each other, and it was frustrating. So I just started compiling all the information myself into a Google document, and I was going to share it with maybe 1 or 2 friends that I thought might be into this stuff too. And that's when I started to realize, my cousin Scott actually said, well, why don't you just make it a website?
Bob launched Retro RGB in 2012 with the aim of providing straightforward information about the video output capabilities of as many game consoles as possible, including RGB mods for systems like the Nintendo 64, which normally only supports composite video and S-video.
My Emperor! I failed you!
Or the PC Engine family of consoles, which do generate RGB video, but most models only offer ports for RF output. In addition to information on how to use RGB video, cables, displays, and upscalers.
The way I do like to think of myself, which is something I've always kind of been good at, is being the middleman. So the information was always out there, and the very smart, very awesome people in the scene were always out there helping people. But it takes a lot to compile all that info. And to be perfectly honest, if I knew how much time I would have sunk into this, I probably wouldn't have made the website.
In the years since Retro RGB launched, video quality mods have continued to be developed and refined for nearly every console, including the NES and Famicom, which now have kits for RGB or true digital HDMI output. Thanks to the persistent efforts of individuals in the community, even portable systems like the Game Gear, Virtual Boy, and Game Boy Advance have been consoleized with video output and controller mods. In 2016, Bob greatly expanded his role as the community's middleman by starting the Retro RGB Weekly Roundup podcast and YouTube show, which shines a spotlight on new developments in the scene that are generally ignored by the general gaming press.
The next batch of GC loaders will be fully plug and play.
Bob's weekly podcast format highlights newly announced accessories and in-development mod kits that could change how people interact with game hardware, new fan translations for games that were never localized, as well as homebrew games, hacks, and utilities. Much of it is information that is otherwise only found in discussions on obscure forums.
Maybe people did one amazing thing, and that's their kind of one project. You know, you wouldn't start your own website from that, you wouldn't start your own podcast, but you still deserve the recognition. So being able to have them on as a guest and just spend a half hour just picking their brain, hearing where they came from, their own tips and tricks that they use, that's something that I very much enjoy doing, and it's probably one of my favorite parts of the work on the website.
Since 2018, the front page of RetroRGB.com has been presented in a news blog format with multiple contributors, making retro news even more accessible. But the expanding collection of tested and verified technical information will always be a core focus.
The eventual goal would be anybody that wants even the slightest technical info on a console should be able to show up and say, hey, I remember Genesis from when I was a kid, what's the best way to play it? All the way to, hey, I'm getting jail bars on my version 3 motherboard with this ASIC, how do I lift this pin and do it? I want to make sure it's a place that covers all ground. So from the very beginner steps of how do I play Genesis today to your crazy modders, swapping out audio chips and everything else.
But is it even worth playing Genesis today? Proponents argue that the design principles prevalent in decades-old classics are still valid today.
Even though they maybe look a lot simpler or more primitive than current games, they have this very, very satisfying, very intuitive gameplay loop, this kind of feedback loop where you pick it up, you start playing, and you're like, you get it right away. And there's, really quick feedback, and in a different way than you get with, mobile games where it's just constantly throwing things at you and saying, wow, you're so amazing. You did a little thing and now you've got a prize. It's not like that. It's like you feel like there's an actual accomplishment within the game.
And it's something that today's gamers might want to try if they enjoy the challenge and restrictions imposed upon them by some of modern gaming's more challenging titles.
For some people, the trial and error element, the fact that there is some sort of very clear goal you have to complete and some sort of steep obstacle that has to be overcome, that's the appeal right there.
And as modern games become ever larger time sinks, adults may find the lower time commitment required for making an accomplishment in older games to be refreshing.
A lot of games you can complete in 90 minutes, or maybe a few hours, and that's great. Then you can move on to the next one, and it's less painful to go back to those games a few years later and say, oh yeah, that was good. I'm gonna play that some more.
Having founded the Retronauts podcast on OneUp.com in 2006, and running its current iteration alongside written and video content on the independent Retronauts website today, Rgb Parish has long been one of the most prominent voices championing classic gaming and video game history.
This week in Retronauts, it's Bill and Lance's Excellent Adventures.
While he has come to specialize in retro content, at first, Jeremy didn't realize he was already on that path.
At no point did I sit down and think, yes, this will be my thing. This is what I should do. It was just, I wanted to write about video games, and that covered the full span of them. And it just kind of stuck.
Which turned out to be a good fit for him.
The current games market is so expansive, and it's increasingly getting sort of not that interesting to me with games as a service and subscriptions and things like that. Esports, that's fine, and I don't have a problem with any of that, but it's not what interests me personally.
As the game industry has evolved, much has been gained, but other things have been lost along the way. While digital distribution has allowed for more experimental games developed by smaller teams, The end user's ownership of the product and the assurance that decades later they can legally access a game they spent money on has begun to erode away.
Over the past 10, 15 years, we have seen so many digital releases that are then delisted. You know, that probably factors into why I've put so much effort into talking about classic games, because I can go into my office and take out a cartridge of Super Metroid and plug it into my Super NES and play it. And it's going to be exactly as it was 25 years ago. But you won't be able to do that with PUBG. I put a lot of value in that.
During the analog era, console game fans in Europe had strong incentive to learn more about game hardware due to regional broadcast standards. Most games and consoles were originally designed to work with the 60 Hz refresh timing of televisions used throughout Japan and North America, but the analog televisions in other regions, including Australia, China, and most European markets, were designed to operate at 50 Hz instead.
Well, the games at the time ran slower on that standard, and also if we wanted to import the games to the UK, which a lot of us did, we had to have a 60 Hz compatible television.
Modern screens sold worldwide today are compatible with 60 Hz, but it wasn't a common feature in these regions until years later. For people like Rachel Selesky, once she saw the difference in game speed, getting 60 Hz output was worth any effort, even if it meant taking a soldering iron to her European systems.
Personally, I ended up buying a lot of consoles and I couldn't afford imports of every single one, so we originally modded the consoles to work with 60 Hz and also got rid of the region protection.
Gaming in Europe was not without its perks, however. RGB video was standard on common consumer televisions, which was not the case in North America, where through the 90s, most sets were limited to RF, composite, or S-video signals.
We needed to actually use RGB because the chroma wavelength in composite video on 60 Hz didn't work on a lot of our televisions, so we get a black and white picture. So we had to use RGB to basically get past that. And through that, we started making our own SCART cables as well. I mean, not every SCART cable sold at the time even had RGB. A lot of them were composite video only.
SCART is a connector that was designed in the late 70s to standardize and streamline television connections across Europe. The 21-pin connector allows for a wide variety of formats to be supported without the consumer needing to know what signals are actually being used in order to get picture and sound, although some understanding is useful to ensure that the SCART cable is providing RGB instead of composite video. This type of RGB is different from the signals that are normally accepted by monitors or TVs equipped with VGA inputs. And while virtually identical in quality to component video, RGB does not work on such inputs without hardware that can convert the RGB color space to YPBPR, which is a signal that no console older than the PlayStation 2 can natively output. When Rachel moved to the United States, she found that SCART and RGB were almost entirely unknown except in small tech communities.
The Shmups forum, people were actually talking about it. There wasn't a readily available source. Even the cheaper cables that you can buy now for like $3 on eBay, none of those were on ebay.com at the time. So I thought, I'll see if there's a market for this, if people want it.
The Framemeister video upscaler by Japanese company Micomsoft had been recently released to positive word of mouth due to its ability to provide razor-sharp picture quality from authentic consoles on modern displays when using RGB cables. Despite costing nearly as much as a new game system, the Framemeister proved to be a popular Japanese export among a certain subset of the classic gaming scene.
So the fact that I was providing the cables and they could also get a good scaler, the market kind of grew from that, but on my part, it was kind of an accident. I just happened to move here because I married an American.
Rachel provides built-to-order RGB cables to the growing market through RetroAccess.com. These handmade cables are built with high-end cable stock that can even exceed the performance of the old first-party European and Japanese RGB cables, which are often more expensive due to their collectible value. And not all RGB cables provide ideal results. Inexpensive cables commonly found on eBay, Amazon, and AliExpress tend to use insufficient shielding, which causes visible noise patterns and audio buzz.
They're really, really thin wire, and it's really flimsy inside, like there's not as many strands, not as many cores. And the actual outer, the vinyl coating is really flimsy, it can wear away. And obviously they're not shielded at all, there's not even an overall shield bundling them all together, so they pick up a lot of outside interference.
Many classic gaming products are pushed to market with similarly unrefined and unreliable designs. Whether they're mass-distributed devices found on popular online stores or at a local video game shop, or a mod that someone's offering on a forum, learning to distinguish quality work from cash grabs is essential for anyone looking for something more than just a cheap nostalgia rush.
You can be really good at making a circuit that works, but to make a device that works over a long period of time is a different thing. You've got to think about mechanical integrity. How is this joint going to hold up over time? How refined is this going to look? Those are the kinds of things that I think take good designs and make them good products, and they're really different things.
Matt Lisi studied electrical engineering at North Carolina State University and went on to work at IBM in Raleigh. But before then, his first job at age 15 was as an arcade technician.
I started out doing, coin jams, and then eventually got to where I was actually, working on boards a little bit and things like that. So that's really when I got my exposure to the games, to the arcade scene, to how things looked on those monitors, and that's what kind of got me hooked on that.
But as the years went on, games began to take a back seat. Matt left IBM to return to school and switch over to a career in medicine, pediatric cardiology specifically, which was a more natural transition than it might seem.
In cardiology, we deal a lot with electrical rhythms of the heart, pacemakers. I do quite a bit of echo, and I'm kind of our group, the person who's really, is this calibrated correctly? Are we meeting DICOM standards? And I see the importance of that.
As life became more settled, it seemed like there might be time for games again.
I pulled out my old GameCube, to play with my sons who were getting older and were getting interested in that. I don't think I'd ever really tried to hook it up to my newer television before, and it honestly it didn't look great at all. It didn't look good at all. And I was like, there's gotta be a better way. And that was the fundamental question that really started the whole exploration into where's the state of things now? What are people doing about this problem? And I think it's the engineering brain. It's like, okay, I identified a problem. Let me see who else has solved this problem. And then it's like, if other people haven't solved it to your satisfaction, then you say, okay, well, how can I solve this problem? And it didn't take long for that engineering bug to get back into my blood and say, oh, I really missed this. I really missed this.
Matt teamed up with his old friend Tony Baker, an engineer at AMD, to start Insurrection Industries. They've gone on to produce their own RGB cables and collaborate with the creators of various projects to turn their work into polished products sold at reasonable prices, such as the Rgb HDMI adapters and component cables for GameCube. Many might assume that vintage game systems offer very little of interest for people who didn't grow up with them at the time they were on the market. But as Matt has been getting back into gaming himself, he's found his young sons taking far more interest in older games than he expected. They've spent time together playing a wide range of titles, from cult favorites like McDonald's Treasureland Adventure on the Sega Genesis, to widely celebrated all-time classics like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. have you enjoyed A Link to the Past?
Yeah.
I mean, tell me some of the stuff you like about A Link to the Past.
Well, I like how it has good graphics, but it's still like original graphics. And I also like how it's a fighting and puzzle game.
After Matt Lisi bought the game console by prolific Wikipedia photographer Evan Amos, his sons even took an interest in systems that are older than what the typical vintage gamer might have nostalgia for.
My oldest son actually started reading that and really found just the evolution of hardware really fascinating.
I really wanted the Fairchild. After reading the book, it told me about the Fairchild. I want that. I don't know if the Fairchild is a classic, but I still want it.
His big Christmas present last year was an Atari 2600 in box, which he specified, which was really fun to find.
The first time I got my Atari, I just played Dig Dug all the time. I also really liked Berserk. It actually has a bunch of RPGs on it. One of them is really good. There's actual castles and there's fighting with spiders. And it's not like a text adventure, you're actually going through the world map. So it's like a regular RPG.
After getting his Atari 2600, Matt's son saved up to buy a ColecoVision with his own money. But even though his dad enjoys modifying his own systems for better picture quality, his perspective was different.
When he got the Atari 2600 and the Coleco, I just said, listen, we could probably mod those for RGB, but at least composite video. So we could hook it up to the TV a little bit easier, get rid of some of that noise, it would look better. And he adamantly refused to do it.
While he prefers to keep his system stock, Matt's son does have mixed feelings when it comes to using CRTs. Cathode ray tubes, the dominant display technology from the time before he was born.
They're loud and noisy and they have this weird squeaking sound, but they look pretty good. And also they work for duck hunt.
I think one of the things that me and the boys, we all have is this sense of relative quality. In other words, we really almost implicitly judge games on the basis of when they came out, on what hardware they came out on. Wow, that game looks absolutely beautiful on the PlayStation 1.
Castlevania Symphony of the Night, love it. Because I kind of like how you lose your weapons.
What?
My favorite games are the games that you don't just start out with some really good weapons, but in that game you actually lose all your weapons and you have to earn a double jump, you have to earn an even farther jump, and my dad said that you can even get something that you could just fly.
Video game systems and the technology that surrounds them are now a big part of how Matt and his family share time together. It might seem like an unusual move for a doctor to start a side business creating tech for old video game systems, but he makes it work.
I really think it's a healthy mix for me. Pediatric cardiology at times can be really heavy, really dark. I deal with kids dying, and I love what I do in that arena, but this helps explore areas of creativity that other job doesn't as much. I do a certain specialty clinic that's really my passion. I could very much do that in a 60 to 80% kind of role, and then giving myself more time to really dedicate to this too. So I could see a good balance.
Retro USB, Retro Access, and Insurrection Industries are just a few of the many companies and individuals that have been making waves in the cottage industry that surrounds classic gaming. Interest in achieving high-quality video output from the original consoles has led to many other products, including the HD Retrovision component cables, the automatic G-SCART and G-Comp switches by Hannati Breach, and the open-source scan converter by Marcus Hiankari. usually referred to as the OSSC. Video processors like the Framemeister, OSSC, and the RetroTink 2X by Mike Chi are specially designed around the peculiarities common to vintage game hardware. Behaviors that are typically not handled correctly by modern televisions or generic general-purpose analog to HDMI converter boxes. This is because earlier game consoles skirt around established video standards to pull off technical tricks, such as low-resolution non-interlaced progressive images running at 60 frames per second, by exploiting the flexible analog nature of CRTs.
I remember the games looking a certain way, and I feel like when you put it on an LCD without scan lines or whatever, it's kind of splodgy, like the sprites don't look right to me. But I mean, if we're gonna get technical, lag is another thing that you gotta think about.
For many, the analog displays that games of a certain age were expected to be played on is an essential, non-negotiable part of the gaming experience, both for how the graphics are scanned across the tube by its electron gun, as well as for the assurance of instant response time between the console's video output and a character's reaction on screen. In many of today's competitive communities, such as for fighting games and speedrunning, CRTs are still standard equipment. Jose Cruz of New York City is a forklift driver by day, but takes on side work repairing and modifying consoles, and keeping classic arcade machines operating as closely to their original forms as possible. For Jose, that means doing everything he can to keep aging CRT displays alive.
The days are counted.
Yeah.
So if we don't do anything, I would hate to see LCDs inside of those cabs. I would hate it. It would break my heart to see an LCD on a freaking Versus City.
But with limited documentation available, diagnosing particular issues can still be an uphill battle.
The fourth cab there, it was missing the color blue. I could not find a proper service manual for that. It took me months to figure out and find one blown 220k ohm resistor on the blue line on the neck board.
Working inside a CRT is recommended only for those who are well aware of the risks and how to deal with them. Even if the display is unplugged, significant electrical charges may remain.
The most dangerous part in a CRT is the anode cap, which is basically on top of the tube, connected directly to the flyback, and that's what energizes the tube. So what happens is you're talking about 20,000 to 30,000 volts, depending on the size of the TV. So that's the most dangerous part of a TV.
Many CRT aficionados insist on playing their consoles only with the typical connections of the day, such as playing NES, Sega Genesis, and TurboGrafx with connections no better than RF or composite video. From this point of view, any supposed improvement in clarity, such as with RGB video and RGB console mods, is inauthentic and may go against a game developer's artistic intent. Another side of the CRT fandom include those who seek out professional video monitors. Not to be confused with CRT computer monitors, which are usually not compatible with the 15 kHz signals used by most home consoles before the HD era. These high-grade CRTs were designed to be of superior clarity and longevity for broadcast, medical, and security purposes, originally sold for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Now considered to be obsolete by those industries, these displays have been sent to recycling facilities and reseller warehouses, where certain segments of the gaming community have taken a keen interest in recovering them for prices far below their original value. Of special interest are the Rgb connections that are common on many models, even in North America. This gives the image a crisp yet still analog feel, a middle ground between the grungier look of composite video and the raw pixels you might see with HDMI output. Such monitors are often generically referred to as PVMs based on the model numbers used on Sony's highly desired PVM and BVM series, but other companies such as Ikegami and NEC also produce similar high-end monitors.
I really like CRTs. I have a Sony PVM 2530 that I've had since 2004, I think. And I just, I love the thing, but do I think that playing my Sega Genesis on my Sony PVM is vital? No.
Due to their bulky size, CRTs have continued to become increasingly more difficult for many people to fit into their lives when they're already using high-resolution flat-panel televisions. Availability is also lacking. Many thrift stores no longer accept CRTs. While a tube TV may seem vital to many, someone who loves to play old games does not necessarily also have to have the ability or desire to own a CRT. For lovers of the original hardware, that's where video processors come into play, so that people can enjoy their games in a hardware-accurate environment, but with clean picture quality on a modern display. Others might find all of this, CRTs, using original hardware, the idea of modding, to simply be unnecessary or exhausting, and ask, why not just emulate?
Emulation is a tool. It's not a different word for piracy. Emulation is, without a doubt, on modern platforms, the most accurate, the safest, and the best way to represent old video games. Like, there's no way around it.
Frank Cifaldi is the founder of the Video Game History Foundation, a nonprofit organization that seeks to accumulate and make available as much information, data, and resources as possible so that, in his own words,
historians have what they need to tell the story of video games.
A former journalist of Gamasutra and OneUp.com, Frank has also worked as a sometimes producer for Other Ocean Interactive, where he helped revive the Digital Eclipse brand label from the early 2000s, with the intent of not only getting classic games back in print on modern platforms, but also including in-depth historical information and archival materials as a core feature of their products.
Something we heard a lot from publishing partners when we were going around pitching this technology and saying, hey, we can get your old NES games running again, is, oh, you can't emulate Nintendo systems, it's illegal. And, you know, even when we sort of explained that, like, no, we're covered by the fact that, you know, this is reverse engineered, we're not using any proprietary BIOS software or anything, there's nothing in this emulator that is owned by Nintendo, this is just playing your code and interpreting it. Even then it's like, yeah, well, you know, it's kind of a weird area.
The industry's perception of commercial emulation is changing, however, with Digital Eclipse and companies like M2 of Japan being at the forefront of bringing classic games to new audiences and to those who may no longer own the original hardware for some of their favorite games.
I mean, the end game is to make sure that software is accessible, right? That it's playable in a way that, if not exactly the way it used to be, or the exact controller is like close enough that you're getting basically the same experience.
The focus then for Frank, along with much of the gaming public, is on the software. An understanding of the original hardware, however, while not crucial for the players, is still necessary for emulation development.
I think something that a lot of people don't understand is that emulation is where it is today because there was a gigantic community over the last 2 decades that figured it out together.
Although he has worked on commercial game products, Frank is not shy about his involvement with the underground community of emulation's early days, and the part he played in making available obscure games from Asian markets that were unknown in the West.
That was something I was really into at the time was, you know, hey, this emulation thing's magic. And I want to play every Nintendo game ever made, but they're not all online. And that sucks. Let's fix that.
How someone chooses to play is a very personal choice. Original hardware, composite video, RGB, CRT, upscaler, official emulation, community-driven emulation, or anything in between. Some might find mixing older games with modern luxuries to be inauthentic, while others might have always felt that the original experience could use a boost.
Getting a little more out of an old system still blows me away more than like 4K. And I don't know why, it just does, you know, it just does.
People that say, I like watching it on composite video. I like seeing the waterfall in Sonic get so blurry that you don't know it's pixels, you think it's water. If that's what you want to look at, that's great, but it does annoy me when people try to tell other people that that's how you should look at it. You should look at it however you want to, And maybe, just like anything else in life, take a look at both and choose for yourself.
I think there's always going to be factions that prefer the visual to be a certain way and factions that don't care. And I think they butt heads too much and they should just let each other be because it's fine either way.
Even if emulation got absolutely perfect, I'd still rather have the original system, the original controller, the original game, because also if you buy the games, there's more incentive to play them. If you're downloading them all, there's no incentive really, personally for me.
You can play however you feel like playing. If you want to use a USB adapter, that's fine. If you want to play ROMs on the Power Pack, that's fine. If you want to play in the AVS, great.
For me, like if I could eliminate all consoles from my house and I just have a controller that plays all the games, like that's my dream. But because I'm such a purist in terms of like, I know the author, I know that this is running in a way that's authentic. Like because I'm such a purist in terms of that, I still maintain all this old hardware that takes up half my living room.
Whether classic games or vintage hardware is someone's dedicated pursuit of passion or a casual curiosity, no one should be surprised that interest has endured and continued to surge.
A good parallel is the classic car world. So, you have a '69 Camaro that was new for a few years, and then in the late '70s it was just an old car, and now it's something that any classic car owner would love to have and love to work on, and it's followed the same exact parallels. For a while you could buy a Super Nintendo for $1, and now they're going back up in value to pretty much what they were new. And it's the same things. It's just anything that was good when it was new is something that should be celebrated and would be celebrated for time to come.
You might as well ask like, well, why bother putting Casablanca on Amazon? It's really old now. It's like, well, I still get a lot. I love Casablanca. Like I still get something out of watching Casablanca. And that doesn't go away because of its age.
I mean, there's a certain type of gamer that just prefers the older styles of games. I mean, there's indie producers making retro style games as well now because they're getting the simplicity of this. It can get quite complex these days, especially, you've got these games that cost multi-millions to produce, and you end up like things like MMOs, people invest so much money into them, and a lot of them are just something to get you addicted and hooked.
I also sometimes like those casual games that they make on phones now. Like you play it and you have a bit of fun, and then like, oh, now you need to buy the full game, and I'm like, I did not sign up for this.
Games now are really designed, for the most part, to pull you into kind of an ecosystem and keep you there. And for you to continue playing Call of Duty or Fortnite or, whatever, for years.
Whether someone is feeling fatigued by the modern game industry, wants to explore gaming history, or simply discovered something new and interesting, or at least new to them, whether they're interested in the hardware or just the software. Anyone with an open mind, a willingness to move forward with limited guidance, and a determination to try again can find something to love in the world of vintage gaming.
We experienced it, we grew up with it, we remember that. But how do we build that appreciation in younger people?
What does surprise me is how many kids I see getting into it that discovered it themselves. So I could see parents getting their kids into it, but I had a few people come up to me after one of the talks I gave at an expo that were young kids with their parents who just, they discovered a cool side-scrolling game and Googled it and found out it was on a, Super Nintendo and had their parents go buy them one of those, and now they were trying to get it to work on their flat screen but didn't know how, so they found my site, and that surprised me.
I will say something that's really encouraging is, I have lots of young cousins, they're, elementary age. To watch them play NES games or be attracted to NES games because it reminds them of Minecraft. Like everything's blocky. It's 2D versus 3D, but they still kind of see the connection there and they're like, oh, that's interesting, and they want to play those older games. Or things like Smash Brothers, I have cousins who have never played Mega Man, but they know who Mega Man is because he's in Smash Brothers. So when they find these classic games that have Mega Man in them, they're like, I want to try that out.
There's more old games than new games. A lot of them are just better.
I think one of the things they take a lot of joy in is seeing the steps to go through the generations and see how games evolved. in graphics, in sound, in complexity, in depth. And I think that's part of the experience for them. And I think it gives them a really great appreciation because they know where it started.
So is it really just nostalgia? No doubt, for many people, nostalgia does play a role. But no one needs to justify their reasons for enjoying old games or game hardware. They simply like it. It's something that interests them, and their involvement makes the scene richer. Whether as someone who reverse engineers systems for emulators, a designer or installer of new products and modifications, a preservationist, a content creator, a homebrew game developer, a vintage game shop owner, or simply as a player. It is thanks to all of them, no matter how they prefer to play, that the past is not just the past, but rather something that is lively and ever-changing.